recording with people that had not the possibility to join us afterwards. So yeah, and again, welcome Janus Boye. It's really great to have you here, and feel free to introduce yourself and tell everybody about the work you are doing in the Boye Co. And yeah, great to have you as part of the Valo Fest.
Thank you very much, Knud. I hope you can hear me. Everybody can hear me okay. I'm joining from Aarhus, Denmark. The warmest day of the year so far. You never know, these things might be a little bit of background noise. There might be a little bit of friction, just like if we were doing this in person. You might have a little bit of background noise, or who knows with the protector, but so far so good. Like Knud said, my name is Janus Boye. My background coming into this is almost 20 years of running a community, which at the beginning we called a community for web and intranet professionals. Since then, we have focused more on the same topics, but today the words are different. We speak about digital workplaces, we speak about employee experience. That was a topic when I last had the pleasure of checking in with the Valo community. And the way we do it is in regular peer group meetings around the world. That's been quite challenging because of COVID-19. And then we have 2 annual conferences. We didn't manage to have one in Brooklyn last month. That wasn't possible. But I'm quite hopeful that we can have one for November this year in Denmark. We've just booked the venue and hoping that we'll be able to welcome participants from around the world. Everybody is welcome in our house. But with that said, let me just jump to this presentation. Like I already explained to Knud, it's a new set of slides. I think it's early to ask the question, to be honest, what happens to work after a pandemic? But on the other hand, we've had this pandemic, depending on where exactly you are geographically, for the last 3, 4 months, 5 months. It's been a part of us. And work has changed. Work has changed so much. The world has changed so much that the word unprecedented has become overused. So I'm going to try not to use it. But let me just jump in. Here's a flashback to the good times. This was the Valo Summit last year in Amsterdam. Thank you very much for inviting me for that. You will see a familiar face there somewhere in the middle, with his hands in the pocket, not holding the balloons, but I think next to the guy holding the balloon, and that's Knud. That's how he looks in real life. And that's how we did it back then, you know. We could take group photos like this. I think I had an excuse like a good old-fashioned plane to catch or something like that. So as far as I could tell, I'm not on this group photo. But of course, this was also before the advent of physical distancing. A very good event. And I feel really honored and privileged that my contribution was good enough that you wanted to invite me back. So thank you for that. That's really, really great. Today is my birthday. So being invited back on my birthday was exactly the birthday present I wanted. And of course, as you know, because of COVID, age doesn't count as quickly as it used to do. So here we go. That was me presenting. I have an age today. That's also only last year. The rise and fall of employee experience. There was some good news despite the title, but I spoke about workplace services and other things. There's a blog post you can easily find, or we can share it later, that summarizes this talk. But though that was back then, and then this happened. This is me traveling the train last week or the week before. I've been doing peer group meetings in Germany and Norway, and this was me traveling a train quite late, so it's dark outside and wasn't so packed. But other photo, you see it from Copenhagen airport. And to be honest, at least in Denmark, I think you would have been arrested if you wore a mask around the airport before COVID. So the world has quite changed, and a lot of anecdotes we can talk about there. It's quite weird. It's like one big closed down shopping mall. So that part of work and the business traveler work has certainly also changed a lot. But it is possible to fly, and it is possible to take the train and get around, and it's really nice to meet people again. So here's how it's been in Denmark, at least since mid-March, when we closed the borders, when we closed work essentially, or at least send people home to a large extent. I know this is also how it's been in many other countries, some more stricter lockdown than others. In Denmark, it feels like also now that I'm not only followed the news, but actually traveled a bit around, it feels like perhaps we weren't so locked down as some other countries. We were still allowed to go to the park and play frisbees, not only with ourselves, but also with family. We weren't allowed to gather in groups with more than 10 people. Supermarkets were still open, buses were still running. So many people were still at work, but it's not so fun when you're doing it on your own. And one of the things that we did in this small community was trying to shift to online, as did everybody else. And not so much during April. I think April was a very stressful time for many people. During May, we started doing a lot of conference calls, and I'm going to pick a few things from some of those calls. I'm going to, in the presentation, like I said, it's a new deck. I'm also going to pick some from the recent meetings I've just held. And I hope this kind of recipe with different ingredients will at the end come out to a dish that you really like. But let's see. So this is from New York. One of our conference call speakers is Sri, quite notable, famous guy in the US. We had him on a call, and he talked about how the world has changed. He asked what we're going to do about it ourselves. And then he also shared this, I think, is from a Slido or something like that, from the first day of MBA school in the US in February, March. And if you look at those words, I think that's not typically how the word cloud would look like for somebody just starting in business school. Lazy, confused, exhausted, crazy, tired. That's quite different. There's something there that's, I think, alone showing that we live in a different time. Then this is something that you may already have seen. It was shared all over the Twitter. It was kind of the humorous part of the social media stream and the news stream that was at times really exhausting to follow. As with some jokes, this is kind of like partially exaggerated, partially true. Many more emails. I've heard that happened. I've also heard some saying many more meetings, video meeting fatigue, social life for sure, useless meetings. But look at the last one, job satisfaction. I think that could be how it works out with an average of no change. I see somewhere it's gone up, but I also see somewhere it's gone down. And we'll have to tell, like I said, it's an important topic. It feels like we fast forwarded 3 years in terms of work habits and tech adoption. It seems like organizations have implemented solutions like Office 365 or Valo in a matter of weeks, what before took months, if not years. So we live in interesting times, and we find ourselves in a world yet to be defined. And this is sharing from a product manager in our community who is based in Berlin. And he asked kind of the same question, like, how will we change? What are we doing now to prepare for the world to come? And same question as Sri from New York City asked. And thankfully, it doesn't look like we'll have to wear suits like that. In Denmark, we don't wear masks at all, except if you go to the hospital. It's kind of the same in Norway. It's quite different if you go to Germany or other countries, but we'll have to see. Prasad Gupta from Babel shared this quote from an article on New World Order and New Opportunities. And one example of this could be hybrid meetings. You know, that was kind of unconventional, if not uncomfortable, before COVID. Normally, those who were participating remotely were kind of felt like, okay, you're the second grade or third grade citizen. Now it's kind of the new normal. And there are other things before that we didn't really enjoy doing before, which we now do, which we now have to do to an extent. And there's a lot of opportunities here also when it comes for the employee experience, as the topic was last year, but certainly also as it comes to how work will change. I've spoken to quite a few who started in new jobs in April or in May. And I can only imagine how it must have been having the first day of work, having onboarding, without being able to go to the physical building, without being able to meet with colleagues. I've heard some that's been meeting informally, some even secretly for walks in the park, things that you could have never imagined before COVID. But there's also opportunities in this, and we'll talk about some of this as I move on through this presentation. So here's the new normal. This is actually a very, very recent photo. This is from Monday in Oslo. For those of you who've forgotten it, that's how a meeting room looks like. That's us around the table, having a guest speaker, Jonathan Phillips, Simply Communicate, sharing some big trends, talking about hyper-personalization, talking about digital dexterity and other big workplace trends from the survey and the great work they do. And this works really well. That was a meeting room that was really well equipped for making hybrid meetings work almost as if
Janus, we lost you. So yeah, let's give a few seconds and Janus will be back. But yeah, hope you recognize the guy in the picture. Janus, you are muted.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can. So
and then we try again.
Share the files again. Yeah.
Share. How come it happened just around the photo of you? Huh? Is that a coincidence?
Of course, I always want more attention. So.
Well, here we go. But yeah, I kicked out all the kids, so it shouldn't be anybody here playing with the bandwidth. But you never know with these things. And I think that's just one thing also, upgrading the home offices. How does that work? People who have space for home offices, people who don't, clearly. But let's move on to the part that I had prepared. That became quite some friction and hopefully also authentic. I hope I wasn't gone for too long. But let's not talk about Knut. Let's talk just a little bit because it already seems like 2020 has been quite a roller coaster year. So let's look a little bit at work before COVID. And as I was doing this presentation, I thought, let me look up how it actually was and how what's out there if you look about how work was before COVID. And there's a lot of funny animated GIFs on how work used to be. You might have seen this. You might have a colleague like John. I'm kind of thinking that you're probably not John, since you're attending a call like this, virtual conference. If you look up #bored at work, I would probably recommend don't do it while at work. It's quite funny though. And I take it kind of as an anecdotal evidence that every organization, no matter how small, no matter how big, no matter how clear the vision, they have disengaged employees. Employees that don't necessarily do nothing, like the previous John or this one, but also employees that are not really connected, not really checked in. And I think that's often the elephant in the room. You could kind of jokingly say that perhaps 10 years ago, SharePoint was the elephant in the room. But these days, with a pandemic, I think the disengaged employees are the elephant in the room. And how do we get them engaged? Why are they disengaged? And I'm going to try to look a little bit closer at that. But beyond these kind of humorous posts, that was at least the intention. It's a little bit harder as a presenter when you cannot see people smiling in the crowd. I hope this was kind of somewhat politically correct humor. So let me move on to a real story. A real story before COVID, but actually not so long ago, less than 6 months ago, at the beginning of the year. I saw it on BBC. You might have your own sources, but perhaps you saw it too. there was this news about airplane manufacturer Boeing, which were facing a fine for the new 737 MAX planes, which were, according to an internal document, designed by clowns. And actually, it was a little bit worse. Here's the quote that it said in one internal exchange. An unnamed employee wrote, "This airplane is designed by clowns who in turn are supervised by monkeys." And so this is a publicly documented case. If somebody's attending from Boeing, I hope you don't feel offended that I'm using this case. But this happens not only at organizations like Boeing, this happens in other organizations too, perhaps not as bad. This is a quite bad example of a company culture in my book, but it's also a case study that we can all learn from. It's a recent case study that we can all study a little bit closer to understand what can we do in our organization to avoid ending up in a situation. And I think it kind of raises the question that's not really related to the pandemic. We'll get to that. But it relates to the question of, why is John really disengaged? I don't think he's disengaged necessarily because he doesn't like his job. I think that he's not necessarily disengaged because he's not capable of his job or because he's bored. I think we need to look a little bit closer at the person. I think perhaps we need to even ask John. I think many organizations don't ask John. They just blindly assume that we're going to do this new project, we're going to bring in this new tool that people love, and then they will really like it. And that's not really the case. And so I think we need to look closer at, why is John really disengaged? And for sure, some have disengaged recently also after the pandemic. And understanding the why, understanding in your organization who they are, how that could be helped.
Janus, we lost you. We can't hear you.
So back now?
Yeah, I don't know why you go on mute all the time, but
I don't know why that's happening.
These technology things, but that's okay. We
so
have to
hold
have
on for a second. Let me see if I can fix it more permanently.
If anyone has a question in the meantime, feel free to pop up and ask it. All right, we will have Janus back in just a moment. So sorry about that, but yeah, we have to all sometimes face some challenging with the technology. So it has been working well so far today. So, but yeah, we give him a few seconds and he will be back.
Are we back here?
Yeah, we can see you.
Very good. My apologies. This is technology, but you can hear me now?
We can.
And then this time it happened right at a new chapter.
Yes.
So you can see my slides now, inspired by Nicholas Bondarengo.
Yeah.
So I think we will have smooth sailing from here.
Let's hope so, but please continue.
Exactly. So what might we do to have a successful recovery? And this is inspired by the 8-step Kotter model for change. I think some of you might be familiar with Kotter, probably the most famous expert out there, very well established on change management. And the 8-step model looks like this. So some of these steps will be more familiar than others. And I think the question here to ask is, how are we managing the COVID-19 crisis? Did we do these 8 steps? Hoping you can still hear me, but I'm just going to pause for very few seconds just to give you time to look at these 8 steps and think about your own organization. Did you go through these 8 steps? And let me move on to what I think is kind of the summary for most organizations. And that is that these steps indicated with red were partly or not covered during the crisis. There was certainly a sense of urgency. Many also created a coalition. But there are also things here that I think we need to do more work on. The vision, the strategy, escaping from survival mode. Just to pick one, embedding it in the culture, leveraging the wins, sharing the success stories. I think these are some of the areas where we have room for improvement. But if you look again on these 8 steps, we're not going to come back to it. Hopefully not have any more technical problems. But this is also interesting, I think, to look at for any new initiative, as you're thinking perhaps on the other side of the summer, which would be kind of the traditional rhythm of the working year. You look at these 8 steps and then you would create urgency. And my advice would be a little bit careful with creating urgency, in particular if it's an inner urgency, not something external like a second wave of COVID-19, hopefully not. But I think many employees, if you care also a little bit about empathy and mental health, they probably had enough urgency, if not for this lifetime, then certainly for this year. So I would look at this model and say, is that the right steps that we go through in the future? And then I would also try to look at these questions. The big picture we have here is what happens to work after a pandemic. But again, let me just go through these questions very slowly so you can think about it. Things that were previously not possible has happened. I've heard many examples of it. I've heard many organizations share, managers share that HR used to be much more about the resources part and less about the human part. Now it's much more about the human part. I didn't thought that was possible. Believe it or not, at the beginning of 2020, many organizations were still very reluctantly, if at all, letting people work from home. That certainly changed. I think some organizations, we've even learned how to collaborate and how to have workshops, not just webinars or virtual conferences. But I think the change model that I subscribe to is also one that if you understand what the problem is that you're trying to solve, then it's infinitely easier to solve it. And often understanding that problem, spending more time. I think it was a famous Einstein quote, or perhaps it's an internet quote that he didn't say in reality, but he said something like that if I had 60 minutes to solve a problem and my life depended on it, I would spend the first 50 minutes, if not the first 55, understanding the problem, and then the last 5 solving it. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, that often we jump too quickly out of the gate. And here with COVID, we had to jump very quickly because pandemic forced us to. So here are some other questions that you can use. And that's kind of why I added this serious part in here that Nicholas very generously allowed me to share. These are questions that I think will work well also as a collaboration internally, trying to take the next level to understanding not just how your company culture is, but also understanding how it is changing. Company culture never was something static, but company culture was often something that got all the blame when things weren't working. Now we have seen, all of us, for the first time ever, at a scale that's, again, to use the word unprecedented, that cultures can change, and they can change really quickly. So here are some questions. Again, it's also important to think about the balance. Any things we need to stop or reduce. Perhaps we were doing status meetings. Perhaps we had a workplace designed for physical presence, even though we were allowing people to work from home. And without sharing any state secrets or anything that's top confidential, I think it's fair to say that this also is proving to be a challenge for organizations that are born digital, like Google or Dropbox, which previously allowed people to work from home, but also invested in wonderful offices, and now have to define or redefine, how do we actually collaborate? What do we need to perhaps do less of? And then last but not least, what needs to be done so that we can become more resilient and agile in a sustainable way? So I hope these questions can serve as some inspiration to figuring out the answer in your own organization to what happens to work after a pandemic. Here are 8 trends taken from a bigger survey that I think are good places to start, to succeed better, and to be more resilient. I already mentioned culture. Here again are the words empathy, well-being, team spirit. We've seen organizations show much more empathy than ever before. I think that's highly encouraging. But to be honest, I've also heard examples of organizations where empathy hasn't exactly been their strong side. There's values, again, talking about stress and resistance to stress, recognizing the signs, smaller teams, perhaps, going in that direction, more autonomy, collaboration. Collaboration is a big part of the program at Valo Fest. We do need to talk about meetings. How we did meetings in the past wasn't necessarily the best way to do meetings. How do we collaborate, doing teamwork? What is really the role of the manager leader? And then, of course, there's flexibility. I see that right now it's kind of exotic to be traveling around. I'm quite sure business travel will come back. But how about going to the office? Will that come back? And the examples I showed earlier, where I had a photo of Knut joining us in person in Oslo, was quite nice, not only to see Knut, but also to see the other crew members. But I've also heard examples where you are allowed to go back in the office, but they don't have as many meeting rooms, and perhaps the meeting rooms are smaller, or you're not allowed to put as many people into the meeting room because of social distancing. Does it make sense to go to the office only to then have video calls in the office with people working from home? That might make perfect sense if you're working in a place with poor internet connectivity. I hope most have gotten that sorted by now. If you're working in a place where you just don't have room to work, then you might want to go in the office. But how do we do it? And each organization, it seems, are kind of dipping their toes in finding that right balance. And then last but not least, the word digital, I felt before COVID, had kind of lost meaning because it was just kind of a part of everything. And now we're truly digital. We're seeing what's possible. We're seeing when the intranet is done right, when the employee experience is done right, when Office 365 is implemented right, when we can do team meetings in the right way, how it can really change work. And then last but not least, the strategy being perhaps a little bit more focused, to use a word that's not already on the screen. All right, so we had a whole new chapter, no interruptions. Hope everybody's still there. No indications of questions yet. That was the most serious part. And here where I'm based, it's 2:30, so kind of early afternoon. But let me go to something that I think also is a part of trying to understand what happens to work after the pandemic. Because when I was asked and I was given this kind of early birthday present to present to you today, I thought, I need some help. I need some inspiration. And I did the thing that I normally do. I kind of circulated it around with community members. And as in the past, I received really, really valuable input. Lisa Mo Wagner from Berlin, she's also a software product manager. She gave me a couple of slides and this question. And I think you might think that that's kind of a strange question to put on a presentation and a conference like this. But I think it's 2 things. It's empathy. We've already heard the word empathy mentioned a few times in my talk. Here is a definition of it. This is what sets us apart from the robots, from the animals. And then there's the communication that we can have between us. And we need these two things to survive. And that's really what makes us human. So here's the part with the advice. Some of the advice, at least, I'll share. That what can you do in your organization to change work for the better in your organization? These are some examples shared by Lisa. She has a moodometer so that people can clearly indicate at the beginning of the workday one of these 5 things.
Janus, we was so excited by your moodometer that we lost you. Janus, you are again muted, so please unmute and
All right, here we are.
We will be okay. Yeah, you're back.
And you can see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it, but you need to just take it up in full screen again. Yeah, like presentation
like that?
mode. Yeah, that's perfect.
All right, very good. So we had the moodometer, and then we have the making time to talk, right? And I think that's what the office of yesterday, not of necessarily 60 years ago, but the modern offices I visited for peer group meetings, that's what they were designed for. They were designed for some of this, right? That you met at the coffee machine, that you could kind of walk out of the meeting room together and continue the conversation. And that's, I think, one of the shortcomings as we're seeing it with hybrid meetings is that those who are in the room continues the conversation, and they might also talk about jazz and any other things that interest them, hunting, fishing, going to the beach, but quite often also they talk sometimes shop. And that means sometimes you have conversations happening at different levels, and how do you make room for that? I had one of our Swiss members who said that they were scheduling the random encounters that you would have in the office. So there was people on the team who kind of did these random meetings with 15 minutes of virtual coffee so that colleagues could get to know each other and understand the other parts of the organization in a way that you would normally do in the past, as you would run into each other in the canteen, but it's not happening so much before. All right, let me jump on. I think this is also a really important part, having some fun. Like I said earlier, I think the icebreakers is kind of like a mastery that needs to be reinvented. How do you do it virtually? How do you do energizers? How do you do cool downers when, okay, we just had a heated discussion or a very important but high energy discussion? How do we cool down now? I had an example of some playing online games as kind of a activity. It's quite a simple games, but just another way to be together. Guessing the movie was one thing that was circulated. Perhaps you recognize some of these movies. Finding these ways also to, again, have empathy, to having a little bit of humor and the human touch. I think that's really, really important. And there are many ways to do it, but I don't think there are so many examples yet. And so from Lisa here, thanks to her, I just wanted to share some of these. Finally, for this chapter on what to do, we, I think, have all learned that there is a limit to how many video meetings you can have with or without connectivity issues or going on mute, I think it's a little bit more exhausting. And I think that comes down to the fact that as a creature, as Homo sapiens, we have thousands of years of experience reading body language, being in the room together, relaxing. It's a different thing when you're attending a video meeting. We don't have that whole set of body that we can read. I've also heard many saying that depending on which application you're on, Teams, Zooms, etc., when there's a photo of yourself in there, you're kind of instinctively checking yourself out. And that's, of course, also taxing. but also, again, being human, recognizing that people are in different places, parts of their lives, in different locations. And I think that's important to bear in mind too. Then here, kind of as a closing, coming in on the last 10 minutes, I just wanted to give you a few other layers that could perhaps be food for thought in your organization, no matter from where you're working and kind of what industry you're in. Keep in mind culture, not just work culture as I referred to, but keep in mind also how countries are different, how some are much more hierarchical than others. You see Sweden, Denmark, Norway all the way at the bottom there. And I think stereotypically in these countries where I'm also based, when you hire somebody, you don't hire he or she to tell them what to do. You hire them because they're smart, talented, upcoming, whatever, an expert in their own subject. And then you hire them to figure it out and do it. And perhaps you can share your experiences. But the other way around, the employee in Denmark and Sweden, even more so, doesn't expect the boss to have all the answer. But as you can see here, if I take my train just 3 hours south and go from Denmark to Germany, in Germany, 69% expect the boss to have the answer. And in India, it's even more. These numbers fluctuate a little bit depending on where you're based. It's, I think, Time Magazine or together with Howard Business School that does this biannually. And on a more serious, even more serious note, this is the most serious graph. You can overlay this so-called power distance with uncertainty avoidance. And then you can find all the way in the top left, Denmark, meaning that there's a very small power distance, almost no hierarchy, and we don't really avoid uncertainty. Norway is also there, but you can also find other countries with large power distance, and you really want to avoid uncertainty. And I think this, in terms of what happens to work, I guess this is part of my answer, like a consultant. I'm not a consultant, but I think the answer is it depends, and it will be very different. And I hope that during this presentation, I have given you some things to reflect on and think about in your own organization. This is a quote by Rachel. Rachel Happe is from the Community Roundtable. I'm a big fan, not just of her and the work at the Community Roundtable, but this is the piece of my advice, which is unchanged compared to when I met on stage, perhaps some of you, last year in Amsterdam. I said, look at community management for inspiration, how communities are managed, how work communities and in general other communities are managed, internal or external communities. And I think that Rachel is spot on when she, before COVID-19, said control is for amateurs. You need to find other ways to, if you like, lead the community forward. And we have a tendency, and even I as a Dane, even though we came on top, there is power and control and figuring out other ways, figuring out ways where you let go. I think this will bring us forward tremendously as an organization. Some clearly hasn't done it yet, but others are doing it, and COVID is the major transformer of that. Then the last person that I'm going to talk about is this one. I don't know if anybody recognizes her. She was a guest star in a peer group meeting back in Copenhagen 3 years ago. She is perhaps the most famous I have quoted yet, right up there with Knud. She's written this book, and I think this is interesting for all of us. It's certainly also something that I find really relevant, that how do we get people to do stuff when they don't have to? How do we get people to do stuff when they don't report to me, when I can't just tell them what to do? I think that's quite interesting. And she has, in this book, 7 steps, or as she calls it, drivers of motivation. And I'm not going to name all of them, but I'm just going to show that a few of them. And that's, the need to belong, habits. Some of you might also be familiar with carrots and sticks. I don't know if that's something that's practiced in your organization. I think carrot is more my preferred way than the stick. There's also instincts. I think those of you attending here, listening in, are probably also motivated by the desire for mastery. Susan also has an interesting chapter on tricks of the mind. And then last but not least, I'm not doing it in any particular order, but I'm mentioning this last one because that's, I think, the most important one to understand, and that's the power of stories. And so you probably already know that stories are the great connector between people, and stories can really be transformative for understanding the strategy and the vision and why you are at work. But the most impactful stories are the stories we tell ourselves. So if I tell myself that, hey, I'm never late, I always iron my blue shirt, then I have a certain persona. And if you want me to do stuff, if you want me to be a part of the future of work in your organization with a certain behavior, then you can speak to that. And if you can fit in the change you want to the story I'm telling myself, then I think you're in a good place to move forward with empathy and conversations after the pandemic. So that's the final quote from Susan, and we're coming up here at the end. Again, don't just do what often happens in these projects, demographic variables. How old am I? Do I live in a house? Do I have kids? But do think about the psychographic ones too. And that's back to the empathy that I think is such an important word these days. All right, that's what I had prepared. Are you still there, Knut?
I'm here, of course.
All right, I have just one more thing. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
All right, so one more thing. And then, as you might remember, those of you who are still there from the beginning, with a little bit of technical hiccups here and there, Sri asked this question at the beginning: the world has changed, so how are you going to change? And I think that's another good question. And as you're thinking about that, perhaps also with the rest of the day, the other presentations you will attend, do keep just two things in mind. There is no playbook. Nobody here has done anything like this before, so keep it in mind. We're exploring new territory together. We're exploring the future of work right now. It used to be when we did the peer group meetings in Oslo and we talked about future workplace, we didn't necessarily say that this was 2023 or 2025 that we were talking about, but we were certainly in the future. And when it comes to work, we are there right now, and there is no playbook. And then, as the now late Steve Jobs said, and that's my closing part, stay hungry, stay foolish. Thank you very much for joining. That's what I had, Knut.
Yeah, but that was awesome. And it's always interesting to see how to tackle the hiccups from the technical side. So at least we had a challenge, so that's great. And everybody sees that everything is live, which is also great. So if anyone has questions to Janus, feel free to unmute yourself, come on the camera if you want, or just unmute yourself and speak up and ask questions about this session. But thank you for sharing your insights.
I'm glad that you love your positivity, Knut. That's one of the things that I see as the DNA of the value community, Valo. I'll admit from this side of the table that it was a little bit stressful with the technical hiccups. I hope from an experience point of view, it wasn't too bad.
You know, I understand it. If I would have been in your shoes, I would also be more stressed. So, but these things happen, you know, and as a presenter myself, I know that the demo ghost is always there. So it's what it is, and we just need to make the best of it. And that's why we are here helping you with moderating. So at least someone will talk in the breaks. So, so that's fine. But it looks like no one has raised their hands or no one is asking the questions. So that means that if no one has any questions, we will give you like a small break right now. So before the next session that is coming, and that is the last session before we have our happy hour. And actually, I don't know if you know that, Janus, but our good friend Jonathan is actually joining us for the happy hour to present the same session he presented on Saturday, no, on Monday here in Oslo with the
Oh,
6
wow.
workplace meta trends, because I was really encouraged by that session. So I really reached out to Jonathan Phillips from Simply Communicate to have him also attend. So please stay
Very nice.
tuned with everybody here for the next 2 hours. We are gonna have a happy hour in 2 hours time. I know in 1 hour time after the next session, where we also will share a special unique Valo drink and how you can mix it. So yeah, but thank you again, Janus, and it was
You're
really
very
great to see you
welcome.
in
I
person.
think everybody deserves a break after listening to me for 45 minutes. I'll just say as much as if you have Jonathan later, there is a lot to look forward to. That is a really good presentation. I hope you still have some energy left after listening to me. If you found this at all helpful or interesting, like Knut has already said, it's being recorded. Feel free to connect with me as well. Happy to share the slides. And if I can be helpful in any way, please do let me know. And perhaps finally, last but not least, good luck on your journey. We're in this together and we're here to help. So all the best.
Yeah, thank you so much, Janus, and happy birthday, by the way. So go and enjoy your birthday party, and thank you for spending some time with us when you have the birthday and everything. So and feel free also to reach out with both with all of us also on the social media. We are still having the hashtag Ask Valo Fest, so you can keep asking Janus and everyone else that has presented questions there. We are also there from the Valo team. So thank you again, and yeah, happy birthday from all of us to you. So
thank you,
good to see you.
Thank you. We made it.
Yeah, perfect. We did it. That's great. So
all
enjoy
right,
your
have a good break.
and thank you so much. And see everyone in 14 minutes for the next session that is coming, and that's a session from Paul Miller, which is the CEO and founder of the Digital Workplace Group. So he will talk about Decade of Courage Manifesto. So that will be a quite so interesting session as well. So see everyone back in 30 minutes in the same room. And please don't forget the happy hour, where we have some Valo love, fun, and surprises coming. And as I mentioned, we have Jonathan Phillips from Simply Communicate coming in and talking about 6 workplace meta trends. So that's also everything at 4 p.m. Central European time. So I will stop the recording now and allow everybody to have a break, and see you very, very soon. Thank you for joining.